All right. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We have a webinar today called Introduction to Community Land Trust. So hopefully you all have made your way to the right place and are here for that conversation. My name's Beth Source. I'm the Vice President of Sector Growth here at Grounded Solutions Network. And this webinar is made possible by the Washington State Department of Commerce, and it's put on as part of the Home Futures Institute, which is a joint initiative between Grounded Solutions Network and the Northwest Community Land Trust Coalition. So as we get started, here's today's agenda. Julie Brunner is gonna offer a quick introduction to CLT presentation. We're going to pause for some question and answers generally about community land trusts. And then Dean Fearing is going to share about his organization, the Culshan Community Land Trust, and we'll save some time with questions specifically for Dean, and then wrap up with some reminders.
All right, thank you, Beth. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, super. So my name is Julie Brunner. I have two hats that I wear pretty commonly. I am on staff for Opal Community Land Trust on Orcas Island in Washington and San Juan County. And then I am a housing consultant. And in that capacity, I have the pleasure and honor of working with community land trusts across the country, with local governments, with Grounded Solutions, and I do a lot of training and technical assistance for all those groups. And I also have had the pleasure of working on the Home Futures Institute, so that's what brings me here today. So as Beth said, I'm going to start off with a little bit of a pretty basic introduction to community land trusts. It's sometimes a challenge for me to have an hour-long session on intro to community land trust, because I could talk about this all day and all night. But we put together a little slideshow today to kind of highlight the crucial components of a community land trust, and then, as Beth said, drill down into an actual real-life community land trust up in Bellingham. So I wanted to start with a little bit of a conversation about the problem and why a community land trust is a good answer or a good solution to some of the challenges that we're seeing in the housing world today. I put together a slide deck for the Home Futures Institute a few weeks ago and did some digging for some updated data on what the housing problem really looks like today in my community and in Washington State as a whole. So this map shows you how much you need to earn to afford a modest apartment in your state. So the modest apartment, they were looking at 2-bedroom apartments, and Washington ranks sixth in the nation with the highest wages necessary to afford a 2-bedroom rental home. And that's $31 an hour. So if you're going to be able to afford a 2-bedroom rental home in the state of Washington today, on average, you need to earn $31 an hour in order for the cost of that housing unit to not be, quote, unaffordable or exceed about a third of your income. So that's quite high, right? It's not really a sustainable number for many of us. Also looked at median home prices across the country, and specifically in Washington. The red and the orange are the more expensive markets. And this you can see kind of broken down for Washington State in a little bit more detail. The darker the red, the sort of less affordable it is. So the Washington State as a whole is solidly in the exceeding $350,000 for median sale price. And we are, much of the state, the west side of the state, is in the $500,000 to $1 million zone. And then the last data point that I found that was pretty interesting about affordability today and where we stand is that prices or affordability in the last year really shifted dramatically. So this is affordability in King County, which is where Seattle is located. Last year, the monthly mortgage payment on average was $2,800, and this year it jumped to $4,400. So that's a 57% increase, or $1,600 increase, which is, really just kind of mind-blowing in terms of what's happened in our local economy. And then I looked in other counties. I thought, well, is this just a Seattle problem? Because we hear that a lot in Washington, like, well, Seattle's one thing, but the rest of the state is something else. And I looked in Chelan County on the east side, and we also saw a 58% increase in the monthly mortgage payment from last year to this year. So it's not a huge surprise when interest rates went from 3.5% to 7% in just a few months, but in real dollars, it's pretty shocking. So this is true across the country, not just in Washington State, clearly. So the other thing that we talk about a lot is the wealth gap, kind of the difference in wealth creation opportunities between renters and homeowners. And in the United States, homeownership is sort of the primary vehicle for wealth creation for many families. This shows a really, really flat line between 2010 and 2019 of the the average net wealth of a renter household versus the average net wealth of a homeowner household. So, from $6,000 of net wealth for a renter to $250,000 for net wealth for a homeowner. So that's really, really dramatic, which is what brings us to the whole affordable housing conversation and community land trust specifically, because we want to talk not just about housing, but also about transformative wealth creation. And then if we overlay those ideas with the sort of racial gap in homeownership rates, Black Americans see a homeownership rate of around 40% and white Americans over 70%. I did also some digging looking at what's happened since the housing crash and the recession. And basically any gains Black Americans had gained in homeownership rates in the preceding 2 decades was eliminated in the housing crash and has not bounced back. So if we're going to be talking about racial equity, we also need to talk about homeownership. And then that translates into the racial wealth gap as well. So the average wealth of a white household was $142,000, of a Hispanic household 13,000, and Black households 11,000. And then finally, we also need to be thinking about the implications of gentrification. When we do our affordable housing work, we sometimes can turn neighborhoods around, whole cities around in some cases. But that can come at a cost to the local residents. The folks who were living in these neighborhoods before they were gentrified often are unable to remain in those neighborhoods afterwards. So whatever solution we come up with, we want to make sure that we're not worsening the burden and worsening the problem for the folks who are already living in our communities. So the idea for a community land trust was first generated in the late 60s as part of the civil rights movement. And it was in response to Black sharecroppers who were being forced off their land when they registered to vote or as a result of registering to vote. So a group of people got together and started to try to think of another way to do things. Like, what was a path forward that would provide security and an opportunity to live and grow as a community. And New Communities was formed in Georgia in 1969 with a different concept around ownership. So it was community ownership as opposed to individual ownership. But that community ownership gave the folks who lived on that land some security that they could stay there regardless of how they voted, if they voted, or what color their skin was. So today there's community land trusts all across the country. We have more than 300 nationwide. There's been a lot of growth. Each time the housing market gets really hot, we get a lot more phone calls about community land trusts, but also we found that they were quite effective in the downturn as well. So in all, they're represented in 42 states plus DC and Puerto Rico. We're also fortunate to have some data about how community land trusts have performed across the country. So 95% of shared equity homes are priced affordably, meaning people are paying less than 30% of their gross household income towards their housing costs. And those are for households earning 80% of median or below. We also learned that it's a really effective tool for market downturns, as I mentioned a minute ago. So community land trust homeowners see less than a 1% foreclosure rate. And during the height of the foreclosure crisis, community land trust homeowners were a fraction of those that the general market saw. So we feel pretty proud of that. Our stewardship works not just in terms of helping people build wealth, but helping them maintain their homeownership through those economic downturns. And then the median shared equity household accumulates $14,000 in wealth, and that was after investing less than $2,000 at their initial point of home ownership. So we have lots of different ways of measuring the data around what the financial picture looks like, but the bottom line is when we think about those renter households who were stuck at $6,000, even with limited equity, our homeowners are substantially better off, not to mention the stable housing benefits and all those other things. And then finally, we're pleased to see that there has been a shift in the ability of, or the willingness, ability, and commitment of community land trusts to serve minority households. So in the early days, there was only a 13% representation of minority households in community land trust homes, but in the later days, it's up to 43%. So I also wanted to include some more data points about Washington specifically, because we've just kind of pulled all of this together. So today there's over 23 communities served by community land trusts in the state of Washington, and that varies from startup efforts in places like Walla Walla and Yakima to well-established efforts in places like the San Juan Islands, where I am, or Seattle or Bellingham, that we'll hear from later today. We also did, Grounded Solutions did a census of community land trust homes across the country recently, and we got some of their data. So that told us that there were over 900 community land trust homes in Washington, and over 200 rental homes, and 400 homes in the pipeline. Of those 900 homes, there's been 344 resales. So there've been about 1,250 households served in those homes over the last almost 30 years now. The oldest community land trust homes in Washington were in the San Juan Islands, where I am, and they came online in the early 90s. And then again, we saw in Washington a less than 1% foreclosure rate. So I'm going to shift now and talk a little bit about the basics of what a community land trust is and how it works. So those were sort of all an outline of what we addressed and how we're working in Washington. But now I'm going to get a little bit into the nitty gritty. So community land trusts acquire, own, and steward land permanently for the common good. So it's about community ownership, just like New Communities was back in 1969. But what you do on top of that land can vary depending on community needs. So most of us include affordable housing, but some of us also have commercial spaces we do on Orcas, community spaces, and farmland or open spaces. Community land trusts are nonprofit organizations with a defined service area, generally a corporate membership or some sort of community stakeholder ownership, and a tripartite board. And when I reference the tripartite board, that's one of the really sort of important tenets of a community land trust, because our homeowners are represented on our boards, which means that they have a stake in the governance of the community of the organization moving forward, and what we do or what we don't do in the future. So a third of our board members are leaseholders, a third are community members, and then a third are generally considered public stakeholders of one nature or another. And then the sort of underlying tenet of the homeownership work we do revolves around dual ownership. So when we create a unit of affordable housing, the individual purchases the land, the low to moderate income family or household purchases, purchases the improvement or the home, and the community retains ownership of the land. And then we have a 99-year ground lease that ties the improvements of the land together and secures the community interest in that land for the long run. That ground lease contains a resale provision, which dictates the maximum price for which a home can be sold in the future. So we sell the homes at a below market rate initially, and then that lower price is perpetuated through the ground lease and through the resale formula in the ground lease over and over and over again, so that we're able to sell these homes at an affordable price to a low to moderate income family, resale after resale after resale. And when you saw that data in the beginning about what's happened in Washington State, we've been able to demonstrate that, 350 times that's been successful in generating a new affordable price to the next low to moderate income family that buys one of our homes. So this 99-year-old idea, this 99-year contract that we're running into with our leaseholder partners also carries with it some pretty substantial responsibility. So as a community land trust, we talk a lot about stewardship. We steward the structures. We provide stewardship and support for our leaseholders and our homeowners, and also for the public funds. So it's important that we think about all three of those components. We're not doing anyone any favors if we walk away and we just think that these things are going to be self-perpetuating or self-policing through something like a title company. We've learned that that doesn't work, so we have to pay attention and be present during the resales. We need to support our homeowners during economic downturns, during COVID, for example, when all of a sudden in a community like mine, 90% of our homeowners lost their employment and lost their income in a minute when the economy shut down. And so we were here and reached out to everybody and provided substantial support to our homeowner base during that period to make sure that nobody lost their home because of COVID. And then the structures, we want to make sure that when these homes are sold, they're sold in good condition to the next low to moderate income buyer. It's not enough to just limit the price, but we want to make sure that the quality of the home is maintained over time. And we have a lot of support structures in place to do that. So we're not doing anyone favors also if we create these 99-year obligations and we don't have an organization that's around in the long term to support that stewardship capacity. So we talk a lot about organizational sustainability in for the community land trusts themselves. We all include operating grants and donations, fundraising in our normal routine business. Stewardship is not a money-making activity. It's an obligation. It's something that we do, and it's something that we're good at doing, but it does cost something, and we have to go out and find the money to do that. That being said, we do include developer fees in our development, so that can sometimes offset some of our stewardship responsibilities. And then there's this portfolio revenue that we do generate a little bit. We have a very modest lease fee that we charge. Some of that is to generate a little bit of revenue once our portfolio grows, but it's also a little bit to maintain a financial relationship with our homeowners. So if a homeowner gets in trouble, they quit paying their lease fee before they quit paying the bank. So it's the canary in the coal mine kind of thing. And then we have some fees that we assess at resale. And some community land trusts have realtors on staff so that instead of paying something to an outside entity, they're able to capture that resource as well for their ongoing stewardship and management of resales, that sort of thing. So community land trusts do a lot of different things, as I mentioned in the beginning. So affordable housing is one of the big things that we do, and kind of the primary thing that we do. It can include rental units, home ownership, or limited equity co-op units. Those can be scattered site. Places like Colshan has acquired units across the city for years, or it can be community land trust developed or some sort of developer partnership. We do also sometimes we'll have set asides for some land preservation or community spaces. Places like Lopez Community Land Trust include agriculture in their portfolio, and then some of us have commercial spaces as well. The sources of funding for community land trusts are no different than that of any affordable housing entity. They include state, local, federal funding, as well as more and more a lot of local philanthropy, donations, fundraising, even for the capital expenses. And then we can stretch that funding and that affordability a little further, because once in the state of Washington, we got the Department of Revenue issued a notice for tax assessors that our homeowners should be taxed, but they should be taxed on their resale restricted value. So on Orcas Island example, where I am, our homes sell for under $200,000, but they're appraising it close to $600,000. But our homeowners then are taxed on the $200,000 value, not the $600,000 value. So, you know, in these high cost areas, if we don't address the taxing issue, then we won't have affordable housing no matter how low cost our units are. So it's important that we do that as well. We also make sure that our homes are efficient. You know, we want to reduce operating costs for our homeowners. And then there are some other communities, in some other communities, there's other advantages and resources available as well. There are some ownership variations, as I mentioned, rental and cooperative housing a minute ago, but then sometimes we use deed restrictions instead of the leasehold for the legal mechanism to secure the long-term affordability. If you're a community land trust building co-ops, for example, there isn't any ground to lease underneath a third-story co-op, or not co-op, condo. But so in those cases, we might use a deed restriction instead of a ground lease to secure the long-term affordability and to embed the resale restriction. There's also different ways to develop and acquire units. That might be a new construction. It might be through a developer partnership with a nonprofit or a for-profit developer. It might be a buyer-initiated program where folks go around and look for a house on the open market and they bring some subsidy and the community land trust as a partner buyer. And then some groups might sort of contract or monitor units that come through, say, a city's inclusionary housing program. So maybe the unit never is owned by the community land trust, but they're still the long-term steward of the affordability and support for the homeowners and the structures themselves. So the affordability gap is really substantial. And when I opened up and was talking about, you know, what's the high cost issues that we're facing right now in our community and across Washington, these were Washington figures that I used. So, you know, a median market price of $450,000. This was a couple months ago when I put this together. The median income family for the state of Washington earning 65% of median could afford a mortgage of about $200,000, assuming it's an affordable mortgage, meaning not paying more than a third of their income towards their housing cost, means that we've got an affordability gap of $250,000 to help that family get in a home. It used to be that down payment assistance programs could support those kinds of gaps, but that's when they were $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, not when they're $250,000. So that's really led us to this idea of trying to lower the price and keep it lower instead of of popping in and out from a financing mechanism. So the green line represents the market price, which keeps going up and up. The affordable price goes up, but not nearly as fast. And the difference between those is the gap. So what community land trusts do is we make sure that that affordable price is kept down in an appropriate level for our low to moderate income buyers, whoever the target income is. And that's another thing that might vary by community. Some groups target solely people earning 80% of median below, because that's what a lot of the public funding sources are tied to. But other groups like Opal, where I work, we can serve people over 80% of median as well, because we have some units that don't have public resources in them. And then we're always looking to find a fair balance between the individual wealth creation opportunity and the community affordability. We can't have it both ways. We can't let people walk away with that $250,000 and still have an affordable home in our community for the next buyer. So we try to always balance, make sure that our homeowners are generating wealth, that this is not just a rental housing opportunity for them, but that we also maintain that opportunity for the next buyer. And I'm going to show a little bit of a few real life examples. And I'll tell you, as somebody who sat at the closing table, I thought community land trusts were a brilliant idea the minute I heard about them from the public funder or from the community perspective. But the first time I sat down at a sales table, I was a little anxious about how the sellers would feel about it, right? Actually selling at that limited equity, that resale restricted price. And I was really pleasantly surprised that I've sat through now 150 sales and resales, and I've never had a seller, one time I had a seller who was unhappy with their proceeds, but 99% of the time, it's sellers who are delighted to pass the opportunity on to another family because they recognize the value it had in their life. And I'll also say that what I find too, when we're talking to new interested home buyers of our product, is that folks are interested and curious about the wealth creation opportunity, but they're more interested in stable housing that they have control over. And that we really, it's really what we're all about. So this is a real life example of a community land trust homeowner in Washington. They bought their home in 2010. They earned $52,000 at the time. They brought $2,500 cash to the closing. Their rent at the time was $775, and the fair market rent at the time was $1,500. So they had a really good rental deal when they came to the table. They bought a 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath house for $204,000. Their PITI was right around the fair market rent, and their monthly payment was about 1/3 of their income. So affordable by all measures. More expensive than their rental unit for sure, but it was clear that that wasn't going to last. Then they decided to sell in 2021. Their resale price was $257,000. They paid their mortgage off for $176,000. They paid their closing costs, and they walked away with $73,000. Now that's substantial wealth creation for that family. Their $2,500 investment turned into a $73,000 cash when they sold. They had a beautiful home, and they had stable, affordable payments for the duration of their home ownership. And then the next family came to the table in 2021. They earned $56,000, not a lot more than that original family did. The fair market rent had shot up to $2,700 a month. That 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath cost them $265,000 with an estimated PITI payment of $1,500 a month. So, nearly $1,000 less than the fair market rent at the time. So by all measures, from our perspective, it works, and it works really well. And we've got a lot of experience implementing it, not just in Washington, but across the country. So does anyone have any questions before I pass the baton over to Dean to tell you a little bit about Colchon Community Land Trust? I think somebody should be monitoring the chat.
Yes, we have a question in the chat from Sarah. Do CLTs have a target skill or market penetration? What are the biggest obstacles to scaling up?
What are the biggest obstacles to scaling up? I would say there's 2 significant obstacles to scaling up for most community land trusts. One is the funding. So that $250,000 gap is hard to come by in volume. So the grant and philanthropic resources that takes. And then the second thing would be the human resources, right? Today's job market is hard. It's hard for organizations to staff up to do it at a high volume, but it's not impossible. Any other questions? I
Yes,
can't
so
see the chat.
we have another question in the chat from Evan. You mentioned that tri-party committee with homeowner community members and public stakeholder. What is the difference between community members and, let me scroll down.
And public stakeholders.
And yes, and public stakeholders.
So community members are anyone that lives in your service area, and then the public stakeholders are sometimes like, somebody representing the local government, or maybe significant employers in your region, that kind of thing. So they're sort of the larger entities that might be influencing what happens and how it happens in your community. They might be interested in participating, and so that public stakeholder is more of that thing, as opposed to community members, which is anybody who lives and works in your service area.
And then we have another question in the chat. What factors are used to determine the resale value of a CLT home?
So that's a great question, and it's one of my favorites. I teach whole classes on the resale formula and how to determine what the future price of a community land trust home will be sold for. So each organization, each community land trust comes up with their own resale formula. There's 3 major types out there. The most common in Washington is a fixed rate formula. So that home buyer who buys their house at $250,000, that $250,000 increases in most cases in Washington by 1.5% a year. And then that's the cap at which it can be sold in the future. So people get a little bit of equity from that, and then they get the equity from paying down their mortgage. And it's important to remember that that sounds like a small percentage, but it's based on the price of the house, and the homeowner's only coming with, a 1% down payment, if any. So it is a substantial return on investment for the homeowner. And I'll also say that it's important to do the financial analysis to think about what the appropriate resale formula is for each community, because there's not a one size fits all sort of answer out there.
We have another question in the chat. Second. Do you all have guys to start a community land trust?
So Grounded Solutions has a startup hub available on their website. So I'm guessing somebody could stick a link to that in the chat, which might provide you with a lot of good resources, on sort of the foundational startup information that you might be looking for.
And the second part to that question, is it feasible for folks to currently own home in a community to start a land trust with the homes they own?
Yeah, so there are instances and there are programs in places where folks sort of opt in to the community land trust, right? Like I'm a homeowner in some place that has substantial property taxes, for example, and I'm going to be priced out of my own home because I can't afford the taxes. So that might be a reason for me to opt into a community land trust and transfer the land underneath my home to the community land trust in exchange for that stable tax benefit in the long run. So there are some examples of places where folks do opt in as opposed to new homeowners coming into the program. And there's also, it's not unheard of also for people to, like we have on Orcas, some folks who might be very low income seniors, for example. They've got a lot of land underneath the current house that they own. They can't maintain it or continue to live there for a variety of reasons. So they might downsize and move into a community land trust home.
We have time for one more question if anyone want to put the question in the chat. Or feel free to raise your hand as well too.
Okay, I'll go ahead and pass the baton to Dean. So we have Dean Fearing, who is the Executive Director of Colshan Community Land Trust. So Dean, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, thank you. My apologies, I'm sitting in a car outside of what was a very quiet cafe, perfect for doing this, that suddenly became busy. So hopefully my cell coverage is okay. Dean Fearing, I've been the Executive Director at Colshan Community Land Trust now for 14 years. I was fortunate enough to take over Colshan when it was 10 years old and pretty well established. So Colshan Community Land Trust was founded in 1999. Our first home came into the trust in 2002. And the reason why that took 3 years is that it took a while to get those first CLT documents set up, working with attorneys, working with real estate agents, finding lenders that we could work with. That process took a good 3 years, and it took a lot of committed folks to make that happen. Sorry, I'm having some difficulty with my sound.
We can hear you.
So yeah,
great,
first home, you can hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound good.
Oh, good. Okay. So as Julie mentioned, there's a lot of communities around Washington State that are being impacted by home prices. Whatcom County is not unique, but we continue to see steady population growth as people are moving to the area. We've certainly been discovered. Our average home price hit around $670,000 last year, and it's not showing any sign of slowing. Next slide. So what we're experiencing is that our business community is now being significantly impacted by the lack of employees or people moving to our area that can take the jobs that the area wages are paying. And so right now, based on average wages in Whatcom County, only a third of the families that work in Whatcom County can afford to buy a home here. So what Colshan is trying to do, well, let me jump into our resale formula that Julie was talking about. So next slide, please. So over time, we settled on a 1.5% simple interest resale formula. So the CLT, what I love about the CLT model is that Colshan takes title to the land, the homeowners are buying the improvements, and they're building that equity over time, 1.5%. And so next slide. Colshan has had over 80 families sell their homes, and on average, earning that 1.5% interest equity and paying down their mortgage. After 7 years, most of our families who sold their homes are having somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 in equity that they've built up over that time. We now have 141 homes in trust. And as I'll get to, as we're shifting strategy, so of those 141 homes, the bulk of them have come into the trust through what we call scattered site acquisition, or our home buyers going and finding homes for sale on the open market. But now with home prices so expensive, that program is basically ended. So now we're shifting our strategy to start developing new construction homes. And a big piece of that strategy, next slide, is what we're calling the missing middle, or the housing gap. And so it's where those starter homes no longer exist. So with an average home price above $670,000, the starting homes, or those first-time home buyer homes, don't exist in the community anymore. So we're really trying to ramp up our capacity so that we can help a lot more buyers. And what you see here, from 80% up to 120% AMI. We've done a pretty good job helping buyers under 80% AMI, but now we're shifting so that we can help buyers from 50% up to 120% AMI. And again, it's because those homes don't exist in our community. So a big piece of our work now is to move into the new construction model. So from scattered site, we're now building new homes. What you see here are 2 projects we have underway right now. The Telegraph Townhomes is a 23 home project that we're doing in partnership with Habitat for Humanity, Whatcom County. The first 12 homes are done there. And then this year we're starting on our Birchwood project, which will be 18 homes, really close to an elementary school, close to jobs and other services. But a key piece of doing that is leveraging the acquisition funding that's available. And so the next slide here is a project. It's land that we purchased in August of last year, 8 acres in Ferndale. And we're able to leverage some acquisition funding, ARPA funding that came through Whatcom County to get this land. So all of this is to say that our strategy now is to get land in the pipeline so that we can scale up the number of homes that we're building each year. And our goal is to get to 25 or more homes a year that we're building. But the key piece to doing that work is to develop some strong partnerships in our community. And so the Thornton Road project in Ferndale will be a partnership between Colchian Community Land Trust and the Whatcom County Housing Authority or the Opportunity Council to do some multifamily housing too. So it maximizes the density, but it reduces the risk to Colchian Community Land Trust being the only developer on that project. So I'm excited to be moving forward with that here in the next few years. And then the next slide represents a third partnership. So we have Whatcom Habitat, Whatcom County, the Housing Authority, and then we've also been working with our local community foundation, and they created a fund specifically for developing affordable housing. So they loan money at 1 or 2% interest so that our construction financing is significantly less. And they realize that that's a way that they can keep their money working locally to fit a very big need of the community and help move these larger scale projects forward faster. And then we're now working on an additional partnership with our local chamber. This is modeled after what Core Community Land Trust did down in Bend, Oregon, and they were able to raise $200,000 to work as down payment assistance on homes that they're building. So we're working with our chamber right now to model something similar, and we hope to raise somewhere between $200,000 and $500,000 to bring into our Birchwood project, our 18-home project, and be down payment assistance. Because the other challenge we're facing is that it's incredibly expensive to develop homes right now. So without these partnerships, a lot of these projects wouldn't be able to move forward. And then my final slide is our members. As Julie mentioned, membership is a key component of Community Land Trust. We are a membership organization, and our members serve on our board. They support the work that we do, and they're an integral piece of a Community Land Trust.
Thanks,
So with
Dean.
that,
Does anyone
yeah.
have questions for Dean specifically? And again, you can put it in the chat or you could raise your hand and unmute.
So there's a raised hand from Jerry.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh no, you can't hear me.
Yes,
we
we
can
can
hear
hear
you.
you.
Okay, good. Sorry, I'm using a new computer. That work source fundraising that you did, Dean, hi, this is Jerry. Did you is that money that you raised from the business community going to be used for people who are going to be employees of those businesses?
No, that'll be a key component of that, or a key understanding of this fund, is that it will help make more homes affordable, but it won't be specific funding to help their employees. And I think a important piece of this to mention is that this fund helps us get above that 80% area median income. So right now, all of the down payment assistance that we can access helps buyers under 80% AMI. But in trying to serve that market above 80% AMI, we have to bring in some new sources of funding to make those homes affordable, especially for the folks that are between 81% and around 100% of area median income. We can build homes at that price point, but we do need some down payment assistance to get them to where the mortgages that those buyers can afford.
And Dean, just a clarification, you're using language of down payment assistance, but you're really talking about whatever kind of affordability subsidy to get the price point down to what people can afford, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's SHOP fund, self-help opportunity funding, housing trust fund from the state of Washington, and then federal funding that comes through the city of Bellingham, or Bellingham voters approved a home levy locally for affordable home ownership. And so the first round, for example, raised $21 million in Whatcom County or the city of Bellingham for affordable housing.
So in that example I gave of it costs $450,000 on average in Washington to create or purchase a unit, and we're looking for $250,000 of that kind of money to fill that bucket, fill the hole.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 10 years ago, it was much more affordable to join or to build homes, but now there doesn't seem to be a stopping point for the construction costs going up. And I would say that that's probably our number one challenge right now. It's nice to see the amount of subsidies that we can bring in increasing, but it's not keeping up with the cost of building homes. So again, without these partnerships, I don't think we would be able to scale up the way that we're hoping to.
Is there anything in the chat?
Yes, one of the questions in the chat, can you clarify what does it mean to be a member of a CLT?
Yeah, so for Colchian Community Land Trust, our members are homeowners. They're automatic members when they buy a home through Colchian Community Land Trust. But then we also give our donors, people who make donations to Colchian, the opportunity to be a member. And so when they fill out their donation form, they can check a box that they would like to be a member. So our members vote. We have an annual meeting every year, usually in the fall, and our members elect our board members. We do have a third of our homeowners as board member, or a third of our board as homeowners. But the members elect the board members to the board. So that's an important role they play. Before I started at Colchian, we had a home that was in an area that it was a home that came up for sale and nobody wanted to buy it because of where it was located. And so our members voted to sell that home out of the trust. And so that's an important piece or important role that members can play.
Yeah, just to clarify that a little bit, most community land trusts have in their bylaws that they cannot sell land without approval of the membership. And having a membership is one of those sort of community control checks and balances for organizations or nonprofits like community land trusts. And I want to say, like in Bellingham or on Orcas Island, where we have 110 restricted or occupied homes, and Dean, you said you have 144. Was that your number?
141. Yep.
141. And so the land underneath 141 parcels or homes in our communities has a high value. And so it's important to have that community control check and balance so that someone doesn't get all starry-eyed and try to think about, quote, leveraging or, you know, in some other way disposing of those. We do have protections built into the ground lease to protect the homeowners who live on that land should there be a change in the nonprofit status or whatever of the steward. But the membership is another check and balance around that. So the community, if the community doesn't like what we're doing as an organization, they can vote out the board and vote in a new one.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I love the most about CLT work too, is that checks and balances. You know, we sit on over $7 million in assets, but we cannot leverage that in any way whatsoever. And there's systems in place to ensure that that doesn't happen. I like having homeowners on our board to, you know, if there's changes that we want to make to the ground lease or other changes we want to make to our program, having their voice at the table is really important in making those decisions.
All right, we have a couple more questions in the chat. One of them is, what type of staff model do you, let me check it. What type of staff model do you have at San Juan CLT and Colchian CLT?
If I understand that correctly, are you asking about the staff structure?
I'm believing that's correct.
Okay. So for Colchian Community Land Trust, we have a 12-member board of directors, and then the executive director, me, and then underneath me, we have a homeownership program director, a development director, we have a grants and contract manager, and then there's support staff under that. So we have a grant writer who works for the development director, and then somebody who is helping the homeownership program director. And we're, like I said, we're at this place where we're really trying to grow our capacity as quickly as possible in these next few years so that we can get to this place where we're doing 25 or more homes each year. And so the next important position that we're looking to hire this coming year is a project manager. A lot of that work has been falling on my plate, and as we take on more and more projects, it's pulling my attention away from other work. So we hope to have that position filled by the end of the year, and that person will be working closely with the developer. So we work with private companies to come in and build the homes for us, but that position will work closely with those builders.
And at Opal, I'll say that most new startups have a single person. They hire an executive director who has to, excuse me, do everything. And then the second hire is often kind of a program person who then becomes the home buyer interface and gets people through the buying process and the lending process and all that. And then the next hire is often somebody who is more of a project manager, as Dean mentioned. So there's sort of a growth pattern that a lot of organizations kind of traverse through depending on how they're acquiring units. So if you're partnering with an IZ program, an inclusionary zoning program, and you don't have to build the units, then you don't need that project manager person. But if you're doing new construction, then you would want that person on your staff. So Opal we're a small rural community. We are a community of 5,000 people. So we have a lot of part-time staff and only 1 or 2 full-time, maybe only 1. And we've been around for 30 years, so we've grown slowly with kind of FTEs expanding as opposed to the humans in the room becoming more numerous.
All right, thank you. The next question is a bit long, so I'm going to summarize it. How does Quotient and CLT in general are working specifically to address Black home ownership and the wealth gaps?
So for Quotient, I mean, we live in a county that isn't very diverse, but we have marketing. We're working to develop some marketing materials to target some of the underserved populations. Using our Homekeeper data that we pull, we do serve a higher number of underserved households, and we're working to figure out what marketing, what messages work well for that population. But it's a relatively new area for us to be focusing in a new direction for us.
And I want to say also, so on Orcas Island, we also have it's not a very diverse population, but we do have a substantial and growing Latino population. And so we've been working on, scrubbing our policies to see where there's impediments. Things like, if you have an undocumented household member, it becomes impossible to get and that household member is one of your wage earners, then they can't get financing. So we've just found a lender who will do financing for folks who don't have a Social Security number, but who do have an individual tax ID number. So, and then I think as an industry, we are working to try to, one of the things I was just talking to a colleague the other day who's working on a presentation for us for the next Home Futures Institute, which is racial equity in community land trust homeownership. And he's done a lot of work with the city of San Francisco. And one of the things that I think that we've all learned is, you can change your policies so that you get the population. Let's say you're trying to better serve the Black population in your community, and you make your program so that those are the folks who end up at the front of the line because of your outreach or whatever. But your efforts can't stop there if you want to be successful, because we all know that there's lifelong impediments for some groups of people in terms of credit and access to different resources. So the additional supports and stewardship just to get people through the door in the first place have to be sharpened and more intense in order to achieve the outcome that some of us are looking for.
Thank you. This will be the last question from the chat, and we can also follow up for those that have additional questions. What happens in 10 years when property and land value appreciates? What happens with equity?
So do you want to answer that, Dean, or do you want me to?
Why don't you take it, and then I'll add.
Yeah, so I'm going to back up for a second to that slide that showed the resale example. So this was someone who bought in 2010 and then 10 years later decided to sell. And when they sold in 2021, the resale formula price that the lease said that they could sell it for was $257, but likely the market value of that home was over $500,000 in all likelihood. So that other 200, I used to have people say, well, what does the community land trust do with all that money? But the community land trust doesn't get that money. What happens is the community gets a home that remains affordable over time. So that original investment, whatever it was back in 2010, that was used to create the initial unit of affordable housing, stays invested in the land and in the property, and is what enables us to resell it over and over again at an affordable price. So in this example, that home that originally was sold to the eligible buyer for $204,000, and it might have taken $100,000 of subsidy to get the price from 300 down to 200 back in 2010. But then by 2021, the resale formula price was 257, and as I said, the market value was probably well over $500,000 in that community at that time. And so that becomes an asset of the community in terms of a permanent, always having that unit be affordable. So nobody walks away with that additional equity. It stays invested for the benefit of the community.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is an example that's happening for Clotion right now. We have a resale. The home it's a 2-bedroom home in a very desirable neighborhood in Bellingham that's selling for $135,000. It just appraised for $420,000. And this is a home. It's the second time it's sold to an income qualified buyer, and the buyer is at a lower AMI than an initial buyer. So we're seeing that our homes are getting more affordable. But it's exciting to see the program working as it's designed, that it's that home, that equity, the community's equity, is staying in that property and growing over time. But the person selling this home has about $50,000 in equity that they're able to take from selling that home, and they're using that to buy their next home with their new partner.
Yeah, it is always exciting when we see the wealth creation thing pan out the way we all hope it will. And the affordability pan out even better than we had hoped, right?
Right.
So I think that was the last question. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So thank you everybody for your time and attention. I'm going to pass it back over to Beth.
Yes, thank you. And I just want to know, I see Michael's question in the chat about deferred maintenance impacting the resale formula. So I'm going to also chat, this is addressed partially in or initially in the model ground lease. So I'm going to chat that link in just a moment. And I think to some extent what Julie and I have been talking about is deferred maintenance is an area in the field where we need to be building out more template policies and procedures. And so I'm not sure, Julie, you should correct me if I'm wrong, if we have a great answer to that beyond what's in the ground lease. But if you want to weigh in, I will find the
ground lease. There's two things. Well, there's three things about deferred maintenance. One is that the ground lease says that, as you're mentioning or referring to, that the home has to be sold in good condition. So what that means is when you have a new buyer and home is selling, the buyer gets an inspection and the seller has to fix anything that's broken, basically, so that it's sold to the next buyer in reasonable condition. And then, I mentioned that we support buyers or homeowners along the way. So Opal, for example, has homes that are now almost 30 years old with the initial homeowner still in them. So we've worked with that neighborhood to help them get bids and collectively get a better price on roofing and things like that. So we have stewardship functions that support ongoing repairs and maintenance. And then the third thing that we talk about and that we implement sometimes are actually reserve funds. So people, for some organizations, Opal's one of them, our homeowners pay $50 a month in addition to the ground lease fee, which goes into a reserve fund for that house, which helps pay for just the roofing, painting, and siding of the home in the future. So we try to build, I always say that the answer to maintenance in a community land trust is not which one of these things should we do, but we're going to do all of these things because it takes all of them to, successfully maintain the integrity of our homes in the long run. If we're talking about 99 years, we want to make sure that the home's still around in a good condition in 99 years, and we have to program for that.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Okay, so we're going to close out with a couple of reminders. So Grounded Solutions, we are going to send out a link to both the recording of this webinar and to the slides. Give us a little bit to do that. It takes a minute to get the recording out of Zoom. So it's not going to be immediately after this webinar, but we will get that out to you. And then we have 2 more webinars coming up in this series. One is on April 13th, and it's an introduction to community land trust specifically for cities and public partners. So if that is you, please feel free to come back or to circulate it to your network. And then the last in the series is going to be on May 18th. And that is, again, an introduction, but really geared for real estate professionals and appraisers. So again, we would love to see all of you back at the next 2 webinars, or please feel free to share the registration links, which I can chat in just a moment, to your networks and refer your colleagues to come and see us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.